Hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Lives Transforming Video Training Series. Our series is based on the book Freedom by author Derek Wilder. My name is Brent Henderson.
The train is increasing in speed.
Lost our brakes! Hey!
Today's topic, it's one that when I first met you, you were openly sharing and you were calling it your beautiful train wreck. Now, when I met you, I don't know how many years ago it's been now, and I came to you with my own, I called it my personal train wreck. I wasn't calling it my beautiful train wreck. And if you could, I'd love to have you go into what your train wreck was.
Well, I graduated from college. I worked for a consulting firm for a number of years, and then I started my own business with a partner of mine. And things seemed to be going just fine. And in fact, for the first, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years, from a world's perspective, it would be considered very successful. I guess it was about when I was 30 is kind of when it happened, and this train wreck is kind of what we're referring to. What was going on, the wreckage was occurring inside of me, and it manifested itself in anxiety. I would wake up at night in kind of a pile of sweat. Found out later it was a panic attack. I went to my doctor, and he said that he thought it was an emotional issue. I told him that was impossible because I don't have any of those things. And so at that point, what he did was he gave me some pills, in particular some tranquilizers, since I was struggling with anxiety that were supposed to settle me down. And then he told me that the tranquilizers that he gave me were addictive, and so I probably need to figure out a way to get some counseling or some help or something. The better my business would do, the better I perform in business, the better I would feel about myself. And so when I started feeling bad, then of course I would work harder.
Yeah.
The harder I worked, the more I thought I could feel better, and then it became this vicious cycle. Of course, one of the challenges is my drug of choice was work. I didn't have anybody pointing their fingers at me.
Right, because that's exactly what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I didn't, if my drug of choice would have been alcohol instead of work, then I would have been told I needed to go to AA.
Right. So how did it turn then from being a train wreck into what you had said to me? You called it your beautiful train wreck. How did that happen?
What was beautiful about my train wreck is it caused me to search how is my spiritual life and my emotional life connected. And what I found was that the thoughts I was thinking would be driving my emotions, and the beliefs I had would undergird those thoughts. So for me it went something like this. My belief system was that my value and worth equals my performance or how well I performed at work. If I performed better, then I was worth more. That was the belief. So then the thought became, if something bad would happen at work, I'm less valuable. If the business was successful, then I'm more valuable.
Right.
And so anytime anything would happen that was not good, I would have an enormous amount of anxiety. And then that anxiety would manifest itself out into, usually for me, working more. Working more would disconnect me more from my family. And then what he helped me understand was that you just go backwards. Well, if the action is what you're wanting to change, then we got to get rid of the anxiety. The problem is to get rid of the anxiety, you got to get to the thought. Well, the thought was, the business goes well, then I'm actually worth more. What most counselors would say was that's not exactly beneficial. So he would ask me, well, what's the benefits of that? What's the disadvantages of that? Well, the disadvantages were huge. Because when I would think something like, if the business goes well, then that makes me worth more or better.
Right.
Well, first disadvantage was it created anxiety. The second disadvantage, of course, was even if it did go well, I would feel better about myself, and in particular, I'd feel better about myself than you. So
right.
Didn't
the whole pride thing comes in.
Yeah, and so that wasn't really beneficial, because if I was doing well and feeling good about myself, then that would just lead to pride. And then if it wasn't going well, it would lead to anxiety. I really had no upside potential with this thought. I was either going to live in pride and be arrogant, or I was going to live in anxiety and wake up with panic attacks.
Now, I remember when you started talking to me about my own train wreck, you said, Brent, these things that are happening, these actions, that's just the diseased fruit on the tree. We're not really getting to the root of the problem. I think that's Luke 6 talks about that.
Yes.
That you don't get diseased fruit off a healthy tree, nor do you get healthy fruit off a diseased tree. It's all coming back to that life-giving source. And I wasn't finding the life-giving source in where I should have been finding it. I was finding that life-giving source in my own performance.
The challenge was my business isn't making me valuable. What is?
It is.
How am I supposed to feel good about myself, regardless if my business goes well or not. Where's the source? Am I supposed to look in the mirror and go, "You're good, you're good, you're good"?
Well, we see a lot of television infomercials like that.
Right. I mean, no matter how much I looked in the mirror, I couldn't get comfortable with the fact that I'm somehow good enough to feel good enough about myself just because I keep telling myself that. And so that became the real challenge for me, is where is the source of my goodness?
Well, and what I'm thinking about too, Derek, is a verse you showed me one time, and it's the Message translation out of the Beatitudes. It says that you are blessed when you are at the end of your rope.
Yeah, exactly. In Matthew 5, it tells us that we're blessed when we're at the end of our rope, because I was at the end of my rope. And when I was at the end of my rope, it was in that moment that I had to figure out, where was the source of my goodness going to come from?
Can you think of a verse that deals with this issue?
For me anyways, Galatians 2, it's been one of those verses I've really hung on to. And out of the Message it says this: what actually took place is this: I tried keeping rules and working my head off to please God, and it didn't work. This would even be giving me too much credit. I don't know that I was even trying to please God, but I was trying to please somebody or something to make myself feel better. And I'd have probably been better off if I was trying to please God.
And it says, and it didn't work.
But regardless, it doesn't work. And so it goes on to say, so I quit being a lawman. In other words, I quit being a person who is trying to get their value out of performing well enough. Now, in the New Testament times, law was a way of performing well. To me, I was taking this performing well and making an idol out of it. Kind of like the Pharisees were trying to follow the rules of the law to feel better about themselves. Yeah. So it goes on to say, so I quit being a lawman so that I could be God's man. Christ's life showed me how and enabled me to do it. And this next phrase is really key. I identified myself completely with him. See, why that's so important is because I was identifying myself, who I am, not with him. I was identifying myself with my work. And it goes on to say, I've been crucified with Christ. So my ego is no longer central. It's no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion. And I'm no longer driven to impress God. And here's the key phrase: because Christ lives in me.
Oh, wow.
See, so Christ in me is what gives me my goodness, not my work. See, in that moment, whether my work is going well or my work is going poorly, my value, my goodness, isn't coming from my work. It's coming from the fact that Christ is in me. Christ, 100% righteous, via the Holy Spirit, completely perfect, that is in me now, living in me.
Do the next verse. I remember this because we think somehow that when we perform well, it ups who we are in Christ's eyes somehow, but it's not about our works. It's about that gift. What does that say at the end of that verse?
Well, Paul puts a very emphatic exclamation point on the end of this section in chapter 2. He says, now, is it not clear to you that to go back to that old rule-keeping, peer-pleasing religion, in other words, to go back to trying to perform yourself into goodness, would be an abandonment of everything personal and free in my relationship with God? Paul says, I refuse to do that, to repudiate God's grace. In other words, he's saying, God's grace has given you the goodness, and you're acting like the grace doesn't exist. You're acting like you're not good enough. Yeah. You're acting like God's grace, God in you, somehow needs help. Somehow you got to find other ways to make yourself feel good. And when you do that, you're repudiating God's grace. You're not taking what he's given you, his goodness, and finding worth and value there. You're trying to find it somewhere else. You're repudiating that grace. It goes on finally to say, if a living relationship with God could come by rule keeping, the way I would say it, if a living relationship could come by me performing really well, then Christ died unnecessarily.
That's huge.
And without this train wreck, I honestly don't think that I would have been able to understand God's grace.
So, Derek, how does then identifying myself completely with Christ, as the beginning of that verse says, how does that help really, fix or correct this issue we're dealing with?
Well, we can go right back to the beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and actions. So when my belief now changes from the old, my value and worth equals my performance, my belief changes to my value and worth is completely set in stone because God is in me. His goodness makes me good. That's the belief. Something bad happens at work. Now, I don't automatically go to a thought that says, if my business fails, I'm a failure. I say, my business fails, but my worth and value comes from God in me. So my business fails, but it doesn't make me a failure. In fact, my business has nothing to do with my value. Then my anxiety goes which way?
Well, it's going to go down.
My anxiety goes down. Well, one of the nice things, I don't have to have panic attacks. And secondly, I don't have to be addicted to medication. And thirdly, my wife actually enjoys having me around once in a while.
Oh, man, this is something that I think maybe all of us, I can personally say I struggle with this. That somehow my performance on a daily basis may come down to something I've done, and I have to come back and renew my mind. That whole thing about Christ being in me, that I have been crucified with Christ, and that it's in Him is where my value comes from. And there's one thing, Derek, you said to me one time that we struggle with as Christians, that we tend to look at our righteousness as you have to do good in order to be good.
Yeah, it's actually just the opposite. Our being leads to our doing.
So in other words, I do good because I am good.
Exactly. And you aren't good because of something you do.
Done. Yeah.
It's something God's done.
Wow, that was extremely helpful for me. I have a feeling it probably was for all of us. That I don't have to do good to be good. I can do good because I am good. I love that passage in Galatians where Paul says, if a living relationship with God could come by rule keeping, then Christ's sacrifice on the cross is unnecessary. So how do we handle it when we completely fail or make some really big mistakes? Come back next time and we'll find out.